In the early 80s, Thomas Dolby burst onto the pop music scene with his worldwide hit, She Blinded Me with Science. The song hailed from his debut album, The Golden Age of Wireless, and not only was it both musically and lyrically a brilliant pop song, the entire album was a masterful orchestration of synth programming that resulted in layered, lush soundscapes. Dolby masterfully shifted synth-pop from cold mechanical textures to a warm, emotional, and highly narrative form, blending pioneering studio production with retro-futurist themes. On this new episode of Inside MusiCast, we chat with Dolby not only about his 80s album successes, but we'll discuss his thoughts about AI and its use in the music industry, his role as the creator and director of the Music for New Media program at the Peabody Institute at Johns Hopkins University, as well as his upcoming tours, including his iconic 80s Recollections tour in the US and the UK, his Totally Tubular Festival that will feature his band, The Lost Toy People, and several other iconic 80s artists, as well as a surprise announcement about a future tour he's developing. We're truly honored to welcome one of the most innovative musicians and technologists over the past 40-plus years, Thomas Dolby. Hey Thomas, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, nice to be here.
Prior to making your mark on the music industry with that first album and the enormous hit She Blinded Me with Science, you were involved in a variety of musical projects and roles, from being involved with Bruce Woolley's Camera Club to Lena Lovich's band and session work for various artists. One project that intrigued me was your session work with Foreigner on their album 4. And I've always been curious how you found your way into that project and what musically were you asked to provide?
Yeah, well, so I was actually working as a street musician in Paris.
Okay.
Having been forced to leave London because I was being hounded by various people that sort of wanted a piece of me. Not always in the best way.
Right.
And I went to stay with a friend in Paris, and I went down the metro every day and sat on my backside with a guitar strumming Dylan songs for Japanese tourists.
Okay.
Watching the centimes accumulate in the guitar case.
Okay.
Until I had enough to eat. And I got a call from Mick Jones, who initially I thought was the other Mick Jones from The Clash.
Yeah.
But this was the Mick Jones of Foreigner, and they were getting towards the end of making their new album, which turned out to be Foreigner 4. Mm-hmm. And they had keyboards on the album. They weren't very happy with them. And in particular, they had a new power ballad, which was sort of a fresh thing for Foreigner, more known for their sort of harder rock hits.
Right.
And they wanted a lush synth intro for this ballad, but they were actually already on a deadline to get their vocals finished. So during the day, they would be with Lou Graham in Studio A, and at night, I was left to my own devices in Studio B.
Okay.
With not very sophisticated equipment. My first time in a big recording studio. To my delight, they allowed me to rent any instruments I liked from studio instrument rentals on a sort of laminated sheet. Like, I have a Prophet 5, I'll have a Jupiter 8. Mm-hmm. So I put together this intro for them, and turned out they really loved it, especially Mutt Langer, who was the producer, and felt that this would make a great sort of radio sound for Foreigner's ballad. And then they asked me to stay and play on the whole album, and subsequently actually to join the band and go on tour. But I didn't really fancy that because I sort of felt, my career would basically be done and dusted at that point, touring with Foreigner. And so I declined that offer. But I did use the cash that I made from that album to fund the Golden Age of Wireless album because I didn't have a record deal myself at that point.
Mm-hmm. Is the song you're referencing, was it Waiting for a Girl Like You?
Yeah, that's correct. And I played on, most of the tracks on the album, including one called Urgent that I think was, a little bit influenced by a song of mine called Urges that had been on the demo tape that they'd originally heard.
Oh, okay. That makes sense. Yeah. Well, from there, Bruce Woolley's Camera Club was a band you were a part of in the late 70s. But talk to us about the song Video Killed the Radio Star, because I know that there were two versions of the song, Bruce's version and, of course, the Buggles, which was with Trevor Horn and Jeff Downes. Talk to us about these two versions of the song and the relationship with Bruce, Trevor, and Jeff.
Bruce co-wrote the song with Trevor Horn and Jeff Downes, and then sort of went their separate ways. So Bruce formed his own band, the Camera Club, and got his own record deal. And Trevor and Jeff formed the Buggles, and we each did sort of rival versions of the song. And Bruce's was more rocky, sort of, less studio gimmickry oriented. And, guess which version was a hit?
Yeah.
I think, somewhat to Bruce's chagrin, but, he stayed connected to Trevor over the years and co-wrote a lot of other songs with him, like some Grace Jones stuff later on.
Okay. Yeah, so from there you joined Lena Lovich's band and toured with her, but you were also involved in writing her song New Toy, which was, a sizable hit. But I'm curious, prior to penning that song and not really knowing like the timeline of when you began songwriting, had you written other songs, or was this kind of a foray into songwriting for you?
I'd written songs before. Early on they were just fragments, an intro here, a hook there, an instrumental section. I didn't yet have the songwriting craft down, of how to sort of structure songs. I toured the USA with Bruce as his keyboard player, supporting Lena. And I was very impressed with her, and I wrote this song for her basically in my hotel room, at night during the tour. And sent her a demo tape, didn't really hear anything. And about 3 months later, I got a call saying, well, we're in the rehearsal studio. We're actually jamming on that song that you sent Lena. Why don't you come down? And I ended up joining the band, and she recorded my song. So what was basically happening then was that, so I was in this Foreigner album. I was on Lena's record, which I'd written. That was a big hit in the UK. We got on Top of the Pops and things like that. So the industry was starting to prick up their ears, and I was shopping my own demo tapes at that point of songs that I'd written. And so it didn't take long for me to finally get a record deal of my own.
I see. Of course, we all know that, you're one of the preeminent pioneers of the use of synths and technology, dating all the way back to the 70s. But as I understand it, you were essentially self-taught, correct? I mean, talk to us about where this interest in music and technology spawned.
Yeah, I'd always been very musical. I actually started playing guitar before I played keyboards when I was sort of 12 or 13. I switched to keyboards and got interested in jazz piano, really, listening to people like Dave Brubeck and Thelonious Monk and Bill Evans and so on. But it lacked a certain energy. I was living in London at the time, and punk rock was taking off, and that had this great sort of cultural, angst about it, which was really thrilling. But, much of the music didn't really hit the right buttons for me in terms of its sophistication until some bands came along that sort of blended the two, like XTC and Talking Heads, Television and so on,
right.
who had that sort of punk rebellion, but had more sophisticated melodies, chord sequences, lyrics, and so on. And simultaneous to that, there was this sort of DIY style emerging via electronics. In the mid-70s, electronics and synthesizers were expensive and bulky and didn't stay in tune very well. And so it was only big studios and sort of, bands like Tangerine Dream and Pink Floyd and so on were using synths. But I think probably the trigger was that when Bowie and Eno went to Berlin and did that trio of albums there, and he was getting in the charts with songs like Sound and Vision, that had a very clear electronic sound to them, and yet they were pop records. And that was very inspiring because, we'd heard sort of, bands like Kraftwerk and so on, but they still seemed quite esoteric until Bowie did it. And the next pivot point, really, I think, was Gary Newman, going on Top of the Pops. And unlike Bowie, he wasn't already an international star. He was like the kid next door, that had sort of, put on some eyeliner and was standing posing in front of the mirror with a hairbrush. He was, and that was very inspiring because that meant that anybody could do it. Yeah. And so that sort of started this underground movement of machine-oriented pop music, further explored by people like Soft Cell and Ultravox, and the Human League and so on. And so in parallel to the new wave movement, there was this sort of DIY electronic pop movement going on. And I sat somewhere really between the two of them. But yeah, I mean, as you said, I was self-taught, never really trained as a keyboard player, and my keyboard skills are limited, but I tend to take a very sort of piecemeal approach to my arrangements, rather orchestral actually, in terms of sort of motifs and counterpoint and different colors and textures provided by different sounds that sort of, knit together into a patchwork.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about like when you were coming up through the industry and that time period, which you mentioned was sort of during that London punk scene. And I thought to myself, keyboards at the time were not cheap, and they were also extremely heavy. And I just wondered, even if a punk band wanted to incorporate some sort of synth or keyboards into their music, it was probably maybe cost prohibitive for some bands. Would you say?
Yeah, for sure. And then it also wasn't very exciting, have somebody stuck behind a keyboard. No, you need to have an instrument that you could take on the bus.
Yeah.
For years there was a street in London called Denmark Street that had all the music shops on it, and some of them had a couple of synths at the back, and I would go there in the afternoons after school and sit and play them until they kicked me out and sort of dream about owning my own. And I eventually found a second-hand Micro Moog online, and I remember taking that home on the bus, much to the astonishment of the passengers. And I had a little bed-sitter studio and a 2-track tape recorder, and so a lot of my early experiments were just done with, one note at a time on a Micro Moog, small battery-operated drum machine, and this 2-track Revox.
Interesting. Well, I know that you moved around a lot when you were younger. I know your dad, your parents' professions, caused you. I think you were in Cairo at one point. I think you lived in France and a few other places. I'm just curious if all of the traveling, and I could have that timeline wrong, but I just wondered if all the traveling had, some sort of an influence or effect on you from a musical perspective.
I think it probably did. I didn't feel very rooted in any one place. I found different landscapes and different cultures quite inspiring. Especially old Europe I found absolutely fascinating. The fact that all of these monumental cities, boulevards, parks, statues, plazas, could have been built really, in a lot of cases, as the result of sort of some rich man's ego. Playing God in these cities, but they were really paved with the sort of the splendors that had been pillaged from other cultures around the world, during the empire building days. I found that simultaneously beautiful and rather sad and humiliating. And I think probably as I got older, I had this sort of mixed feelings about it. I admired these cities and the museums and the art and the music, but I felt a little bit resentful of how we came by them. And it always astonished me when I came to the USA that you guys were so in awe of the old country, and all of that history. You've got plenty of history of your own that was more, it's a few hundred years more recent, but in another millennium or so, that's not going to seem so different. And there always seemed to be this sort of inferiority complex in the USA.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I realize, the golden age of wireless has been, obviously a major topic of discussion for you since it was released back in '82. But if you'll indulge me, I kind of have a few questions of my own, and maybe a couple of your other albums as well. But just a little backstory. I was in high school when She Blinded Me with Science made a splash here in the States. And even though I was always the type who, would dive deeper into the artists that were making an impression on me, I sort of stopped with Science, and I didn't think or bother to check out the rest of the album. And there was a rock station here in Indianapolis where I lived that played bands like AC/DC and Van Halen and Lynyrd Skynyrd, that sort of format. And on a Sunday night while I was listening, they surprisingly played One of Our Submarines, and it caught me totally off guard. And I called the station to find out who the artist was, and of course they told me it was you. And the next day, I bought the album, I fell in love with it, and it's been, a favorite of mine since then. But, in hindsight, and in the general context of what we know about music in the 80s, you were writing about subjects that, weren't necessarily a part of the cultural norm for the time, which, I appreciated. Where did the ideas for these songs, such as One of Our Submarines and, say, like Cloudburst at Shingle Street, come from?
Yeah, it's interesting you sort of point that out. Well, I was never really one to write sort of relationship songs, he said, she said, etc. I tended to look for subject matter that was related to, the planet, to geography, to history, to, in a way, sci-fi, not sort of high-tech sci-fi, but just sort of, alternative reality sci-fi sort of interested me. What if steam had taken over from electricity, rather than electricity? What if the Nazis had succeeded in invading the UK and sort of taken over Europe, and we'd been living under an occupation. And in a situation like that, I pictured myself sort of in the underground, like in a basement, broadcasting somewhere with a coat hanger. And the submarines one that you mentioned, was actually so my uncle Stephen was a submarine officer in World War II, and I never met him because the submarine went down, sank in the early 40s, and on the wall of the staircase in the house that I grew up in was this black and white photograph of Uncle Stephen in his Royal Navy outfit. And, my dad was a wonderful sort of doddery, archaeology professor from Oxford University, and not exactly an action man figure. So there was a period when I sort of hero worshipped Uncle Stephen. But again, as I got older, the fact that his submarine had gone down, which at the time I believed to be, on maneuvers, not even in combat, it seemed to me to be sort of symbolic of the fall of the British Empire. And so that, there was a definite sort of double meaning to the lyrics of that song. Years later, a guy approached me after a gig who worked for the British Navy, contacting relatives as information became declassified. And he said that, well, actually, you've had it wrong all these years in your lyrics. You didn't go down on maneuvers. It was actually sunk by an Italian torpedo boat off the coast of Tunisia. And I thought, this is fantastic. Wow, I'm going to have to change some lyrics here. And not long after that, I was contacted by a salvage dive captain who claimed that they located the wreck of the submarine on the seabed, in the Mediterranean. And they were just putting together an exhibition to bring it to the surface. I thought, wow, this is fantastic. I have to write a whole new verse for my song. I said, well, when's this going to happen? He goes, well, we're just at the fundraising stage now. And there was sort of a pause. Like, okay, either I'm going to have to write a new verse for my song, or this is like the biggest scam since the internet Nigerian cultural ministry scam,
I was probably too young and too naive to fully understand what you were accomplishing at that time with synth-based instruments. But in hindsight, this album truly displayed what could be done to create, incredible songs and compositions primarily with synth. But that said, it also included several tracks with traditional acoustic instruments, drums, like by Justin Hildreth. And I believe your synth-based drums employed, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you were using a Roland TR-808 at the time. What kept you from using, say, all synth-based drums on this record?
The TR-808 was not out yet. I was using, for the golden age of wireless, I was using an extraordinary German instrument called a PPG wave computer, which was the size of a refrigerator. And it had previously been used to turn Tangerine Dream's light show on and off.
Interesting.
But they came out with a little drum module that had a few samples in it, and that's what I was using for drums.
Okay.
And then for manual drumming, there was an electronic kit called a Simmons kit that had these sort of octagonal pads.
Yep.
Or in fact, you could play them with your fingernails, which is what I did on most of my songs.
So yeah, I think the TR-808 you probably used on your follow-up album, The Flat Earth, which was released in '84, and it contained the hit Hyperactive. But there were some other amazing gems on this record, including I Scare Myself, which I think was written and originally performed by Dan Hicks. And I read that, you're a fan of Dan's writing, and I'm curious what it is about his style that's appealing to you.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of Dan's stuff is sort of fairly upbeat, almost sounds like sort of, hot jazz style, but style called Western Swing. Very funny lyrics, cool female backing vocalists, and a great electric violinist called Sid Page. But one or two of his songs had this sort of very haunted quality to them. So he had a couple, one called Moody Richard and one called I Scare Myself, that was a little bit slower. And I took it and slowed it down even more. And we were working in Brussels in a fairly basic studio over there that had an upright piano, which is a sort of different sound for it. And my guitarist, Kevin Armstrong, picked up a trumpet for the very first time and managed to get a few notes out of it. And so, people have analyzed his trumpet playing and said it's, very avant-garde, but it's actually the first time he'd ever played the trumpet. But yeah, I mean, I actually got to play with Dan years later, and we did a cover of I Scare Myself in Mill Valley. He's sadly no longer with us.
And then the song Screen Kiss is another song that I've always gravitated to when I listen to that album. And I think I heard you admit somewhere in an interview, at least at one point in your career, that you felt like it was one of the best songs that you had written. And the setting is obviously Hollywood. And I guess my interpretation of the lyrics has always been that it's about a woman who leaves someone in order to get involved with a Hollywood actor or film producer, maybe even to advance her own career. What is the inspiration for that song? I was always curious where you came up with that.
Yeah, I mean, that was pretty real. One of the few sort of breakup songs that I've ever written.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I had a huge crush on a woman who was, peripherally in the movie industry at that time. And it's really my first exposure to LA and the surprise at the fact that, up in the Hollywood Hills, there was sort of a somewhat different lifestyle from, down in the flats and the film studios and Rodeo Drive and so on. Because it's sort of wild actually up in the hills, and so there's deer and coyote and all sorts of wildlife and all sorts of interesting little enclaves exist, like the Laurel Canyon one and where I lived near the Hollywood sign. And it's sort of bittersweet because she left me for a film producer, and I guess the message of the song is that she could have been with me and really soared, but instead she sort of went that route.
Interesting. Yeah, again, I didn't realize that this was, you were writing from your own experience. I thought perhaps it was just a tale of old Hollywood or something. So that's interesting. I'll be honest, this is fast forwarding a bit. I had no intentions of seeing the movie Howard the Duck until I discovered that you had a hand in the soundtrack. And of course, John Barry composed the score for the film. And you wrote and produced, 5 songs for the film with Cherry Bomb, which featured Leah Thompson on vocals, who obviously was also the lead actress in the movie. I don't know how you felt about these songs, say, in the overall canon of your work, but I absolutely love them, and I especially the song Don't Turn Away, which, of course, featured Stevie Wonder on harmonica. And the song is a favorite, and I've always been curious about your connection to Stevie and how you involved him to play on this track.
Well, in 1984, I think, we were approached by the Grammys organization to do a synth performance at the Grammys show. Synths were still a little bit frowned on in sort of the mainstream, rock, especially the rock radio world. And they wanted to show them at their best. And so they asked some prominent synth players of the time, Stevie and Herbie Hancock and myself and Howard Jones, to put together this performance, which was like one song from each of us in a medley, plus the national anthem. And so we recorded this at Stevie's studio, which is an old Art Deco cinema in Los Angeles. And so I sort of got to know him there, and out of the blue, I think about 6 months later, I was working on the How the Duck soundtrack and had this ballad and asked him if he could have a go at it. So I went down to the studio and he was nice enough to put the harmonica down. I was actually hired originally to do the score for Howard the Duck. But at that point, it was going to be this sort of cult film. It's based on a classic cult comic. And it was looking quite culty, and they were going to do it on the cheap using, Lucasfilm technology. But they spent more and more, and the whole project was sort of ballooning. And the further it went along, the deeper into sort of executive hell the project went. And the Duck himself was a bit problematic, really. This is pre-CGI, so everything was done mechanically with a small person in a duck suit with mechanical eyes and beak, operated by puppeteers behind a curtain. And it took forever. George Lucas, in theory, was producing, but he wasn't terribly interested in it. And when it came to doing the music, I did the songs. We had to do those sort of in advance so the band could play them on camera. But when they started to hear my ideas for the score, I was quite summarily fired from the score and replaced with John Barry, who was more of a sort of A-list Hollywood composer at the time. And so my role was reduced to producer of the songs and a very brief cameo as a beatnik barman in a bar fight scene.
I remember that, yeah.
It was an interesting experience. Took sort of 6 months to do, but during that time I was living in Marin County and sort of put some roots down in San Francisco, which became important, in the 90s when I moved back there to pursue my sort of software period.
I actually met you briefly in San Francisco at the AES convention there, and I was standing waiting for the doors to open to the convention hall, and I looked over, and you're standing right next to me, and I thought, is that Thomas Dolby? And then I had to look down at your badge, and sure enough, and I just said hello and told you, what a big fan I am and that sort of thing. But I did briefly meet you in San Francisco once. Okay. Where the flat Earth was atmospheric and sort of moody, and even going back to, kind of the style of sound you incorporated in the Golden Age, the Aliens Ate My Buick album was a shift in attitude and approach, and you went from taking a solo artist approach to enlisting the Lost Toy People, which I understand was a group you created by finding, the band members through ads and the Recycler out in L.A. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly we're taking a more collaborative band approach to writing and performing. And I guess the end result, obviously yielded some amazing songs. So what happened at the time that propelled you to take this band-oriented direction?
Yeah, I moved to Los Angeles initially for a period of a year on the advice of my accountant, and rented a house up in the hills and, had a pretty wild time as a sort of unattached bachelor, sucking it all in. And so different from my life in the UK and from my life script in general. And I sort of celebrated that really by forming a band and, going out and doing some club gigs. And, it was a lot more danceable. It was, as you say, quite collaborative. We would mess with grooves in the rehearsal room, and I'd write songs around them and so on. And we actually we did a dozen or so club gigs before we ever went in the studio. So the sound on that record is sort of mostly a live to tape sound with a few embellishments. And the co-producer, Bill Bottrell, on that album was really visionary because the sound of the 80s tended to be this sort of very overblown solid state logic sound with lots of digital reverbs and big gated snares and lots of layers of synth and things like that. And Bill was very much a purist, and so on a song like Pulp Culture, for example, there are very raw, simple sounds that are very distinct, very discrete from each other. No effects on the snare. It's just the sound of the stick hitting the snare, mic'd up nicely. And Bill, was really visionary because I think he went on to do the Tuesday Night Music Club album with Sheryl Crow, which to me signaled the pivot from that overblown 80s production sound into the grittier, more raw sound of the 90s.
You mentioned the Tuesday Night Music Club. Did you happen to know or have any connection to Kevin Gilbert?
I did not know. I met Sheryl years later at a TED conference, but I had nothing to do that other than that we had Bill Bottrell in common. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I was curious. Being the innovator that we've known you to be and still are, I'm just curious if there are any current artists that have captured your attention who are pushing the boundaries of electronics, not unlike yourself.
Yeah, I'm sad to say I don't listen to a whole lot of music these days. Every now and then, somebody will tip me off to something. Yeah. But yeah, not a whole lot. I actually really like Billie Eilish and Phineas, and amazing coincidence, somebody told me, so their dad has a podcast, and they mentioned you on it, and Billie was on there, and she was singing along with your songs, and so I listened to this thing, and it's kind of cool. It's like, so apparently their parents used to play them my music when they go on camping trips, and so this podcast you can listen to it. It's like Billie singing along with my stuff, and she's so good. It's so weird, but it's so good.
She's amazing.
She's amazing. I subsequently became friends with the whole family, who still incidentally have family lunch together, and their parents dog sit for them when they're away on tour and stuff like this. But I really like her stuff.
I can't wait to see her film that James Cameron is producing that's coming out. It looks pretty amazing. That's going to be a good one.
It does, yeah. And she's co-directing that with James Cameron. What a coup.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, aside from making music, you've been heavily involved in the development of, emerging technologies, including, the company you started back called Beatnik back in the 90s, which developed things like code that drove interactive audio in Java. And, of course, your technology was embedded in cell phones that drove early polyphonic ringtones. And there were so many other areas of entertainment-based technology that, you were involved with. And I guess fast forward to today, and I want to chat AI for a moment because, with your background in technology development, I'm curious about your perspective on AI and how it's currently, shaping the music industry and, maybe where it's going. Do you have a positive outlook about AI, or do you have areas of concern about what the effect will be?
Of course, I'm concerned like we all are, but no, I'm totally positive about it, really. I think the creative possibilities are huge. And my job has always been to latch on to new technologies that people are still suspicious of, and sort of show the world what can be done with them. I think it's got incredible implications for music. One, I'll give you an example, is that when I first went in recording studios in the 70s, I didn't know which knobs to press. I would be there collaborating with an engineer, and I'd say, "Oh, I need that song to be a bit more sparkly," and he or she would sort of reach for the knob that lets him add, 3 dB at 6 kilohertz. And then I go, "No, I mean more shimmery," and he'd go, "Oh, how about this?" And he'd put it through a harmonizer left and right, and I go, "Yeah, more like that." So, in the late 80s, early 90s. Now you could get a laptop with a recording studio on it. So great. So an artist was free up to go in the back room and make their own album. The only thing is most of us don't have that left brain, right brain collaboration going on in real time. So now you have to learn all of what that engineer used to do on top of your songwriting craft, which makes no sense at all. Well, there are programs coming out now where you say, "I need this to be a bit more sparkly." And it makes a decision based on all of the knowledge it's accumulated of production over the decades and says, "How about this?" And you go, "No, maybe a little bit more shimmery." And then it interprets that. So what I'm getting at is the potential is here for a much more intuitive collaboration with technology than simply taking the analog world and giving you a UI that allows you to do that on a computer.
Yeah, I know there are pros and cons. I'm an engineer myself, and a lot of the tools I use are, they're labeled at least as AI sorts of tools, and they do help. Some of the noise reduction tools I use and are just incredible. But something I recently read that sort of startled me. I read this in the LA Times. Is that close to 40% of all music now being uploaded to streaming platforms are fully AI generated. And there's a push to have these streaming services at least label these AI songs as such. And I personally can't imagine listening to, I guess, and enjoying a fully AI generated song. I've heard them and some of them have really fooled me. But knowing that it wasn't crafted and performed, by a human, for me, it just turns me off. Maybe it's my age and where I've come from. But what about you? Do you have a feeling about this one way or the other?
All the music out there and all the mediocrity has always been the yardstick that I tried to exceed with my own music to stand out and be different, right? I started out, I listened to the radio, didn't like much of what was there, and I tried to make something that would get on the radio but would be better. And now there's tens of thousands of songs being uploaded. Some of them are by humans, some of them are by AIs. Doesn't really make a whole lot of difference to the goal for me, which is to, in the midst of all of this, how do you do something that stands out? So it doesn't particularly bother me. I don't really know who's being put out of work by it. I don't really see that. It's obviously a fear that they're cutting down rainforests and things, but conversely, Moore's law dictates that as time goes on, technology gets more efficient. And so I'm not defending any of those things, and I think the concerns are real. But from a totally selfish point of view, I just find it fascinating. I'm also amazed by the possibilities that these chunks of electronic music that we make, which at the moment are completely ignorant of each other. I program a beat, I program a bass drum, I program a bass riff or a synth riff, and they have no knowledge of each other at all. They don't resonate with each other. Not like real musicians who, you play me something, I respond to it in real time, and my brain waves are sort of locking into what you're doing.
Right.
There's a resonance that happens between real musicians that electronic music just doesn't have. But actually, AI has the possibility of doing that, where there is some context to the stuff that you create that relates to other stuff that's going on.
Like real-time improvisation. Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess in a nutshell, to sum that portion of it up, where do you feel the music industry is headed? I mean, guess not only from the way music is created, whether it's human or AI crafted, but actually the business side of the industry. I mean, what would be your outlook on how a musician will earn revenue from his or her music content? I know it's a concern for a lot of musicians that I know.
Yeah, I mean, it's a concern because you don't sell music in chunks of, 12 songs or, 12 inches or a CD anymore. It's this sort of stream thing. And the benefit to the public is that all the music in the world is accessible at all times, anywhere, practically free. And that seems like a great deal for the consumer, but not a great deal really for musicians, because how are you supposed to get paid?
Right.
Well, in the last few years, the last resort of it has been live music, but it's really not clear that you'll still be able to use, streaming as a way to promote your live shows in the way in the old days it was sort of flipped around. You did live shows to sell more records, and it's not clear where the benefit will come from that point of view. I mean, as a musician, you have to wear a lot of hats these days. You have to be a marketer, technologist, as well as a musician, and that works for some people. It sort of works fine for me. I kind of like being a master of all trades or aspiring to that. But it doesn't suit a lot of people, who can't really deal with the business aspect of it. So that's a concern. But, I would posit this. It's like, what made you think that there was some God-given right that this is the way it's supposed to be, that, if you're a popular musician, you're going to end up being a multimillionaire? I mean, in previous, centuries, you'd sit around a campfire and play, and maybe somebody would feed you, and then it became a handful of musicians, the Mozarts of the world, would get chosen by the royalty and the rich people to entertain them in their parlors, And then with technology, with concert halls, the pianoforte, eventually recording, and then radio and jukeboxes and piano rolls and the internet and cable TV and all the rest of it, suddenly that stuff could be distributed to tens of millions of people, and it wasn't so clear. It was being diluted in a way that it wasn't so clear how the musician directly benefits. But I would say that, we don't have a God-given right to have an expectation of getting paid in a certain way, proportionate to our popularity. I certainly don't think the middle men and women, have a right to be there to plug themselves in, get in the middle of it and earn from it. So I think, it's distressing that, the founders of Spotify are billionaires, but most musicians are getting paid pennies for the music. That's certainly distressing. But look, what are you going to do? Put the brakes on? You're going to go out in the streets and protest about it and get, the administration to introduce laws that set the clock back? No, that ain't going to happen. It is the march of progress, and sensible people will learn to roll with it and adapt and adjust and use the new environment to create a fresh sound, that will get you noticed.
That's a great insight, and I appreciate that, because you're right. There was really only a finite time in the history of popular music that you did have the ability to make millions or to, sell millions and that sort of thing. So, that's a really good point. My co-host, Eddie Cabello, couldn't join us today, but one of his daughters attended Johns Hopkins University, which, of course, is where you've taught since 2014. And I think in 2018, you became the head of their new music program, or Music for New Media program. Talk to us about what you teach there and how you teach it.
Yeah, well, I actually created the program as something that only I could teach, really.
Yeah.
But it's expanded now, and it's quite a big faculty and 100 or so students, I think. Well, so my focus was on applications of music for picture, be it film, TV, virtual reality, those kinds of things. And I think I've done a fair amount of that in my career, and it's a very different skill set from making your own music, in your own name, because you always have a client and everybody's got an opinion about music, and it's really their vision that you have to support.
Right.
And at the end of the day, you're just one of those names that scrolls past in the credits at the end, and you are all responsible for creating this sort of, this collective illusion of a piece of entertainment, but lighting and wardrobe and props and, everything else are important as well. So you have to be willing to forego your own egocentric view of what you're doing and fit into somebody else's vision. And I barely knew this when I was doing it, and I made a lot of mistakes that, probably cost me in terms of having the option to do that, say to be a film composer as a full-time career. And there was no mentor really to explain to me what I needed to do. So I created this program, sort of pass on some of that, painfully acquired experience to a generation of wannabe composers, up-and-coming composers that have got a lot of the talent, but need to acquire this set of professional skills as well, which nobody's going to tell them how to do that. So this is really the first program of its type in a major American university that does that.
Eddie also asked, there are so many musicians who don't study formally. They just have natural talent. Many succeed, and others with talent may get a formal education, music education that is, and also succeed. What are your thoughts on a music education, say, back in your day compared to a modern music education now? Fundamentally, how do they differ?
Well, I think, most music schools now recognize that career path is really important. If your family is going to fork out hundreds of thousands of dollars for you to get a qualification in music, then they have a right to expect that the school will help their kids, find a way to make a living and pay back those student loans. Because, teaching piano to your neighbor's kids ain't going to cut it. On a certain level, at a good conservatory, you can learn life lessons that will be valuable in other fields if you end up not doing it professionally, and you could maybe carry on to doing music as a hobby. But what we try and do really is to prepare students for a realistic career path going forward. I think that's changed quite a lot. It used to be very much the strict canon of music or art or ballet or whatever it was that you were pursuing. And I think these days they have to be a little bit more pragmatic about it. But that's actually why I'm at Peabody Conservatory. They've got fabulous faculty to teach you bassoon or piano or violin or conducting or whatever it may be. Increasingly, they are turning to faculty that have real-world experience that can be useful to pass on to their students.
So aside from your time in the classroom, to being involved with, emerging technology and all the innovative things you've continued to create for yourself, I personally am so glad you're making more time to tour and share your music with fans. And you're in the process of getting ready to go back out on tour this spring and summer. And I think it's on April 14th, you kick off a short stint here in the States. And I'm personally excited that you're coming to my city, Indianapolis, and I'm going to be at the show. So talk to us quickly about this U.S. tour and what fans should expect. Is this a one-man show, or will you have any backing support on this tour?
Yeah, so I'm touring the USA in April, a brief stint in the Northeast and Midwest. This is going to be with a four-piece band, including me, Gail Dorsey on bass, who was in Bowie's band for 12 plus years. And she's a wonderful bass player and great alto singer. Andrew Lipka, who is a multi-instrumentalist from up the road in Philadelphia, plays guitar and keyboards and is a great singer. And Matt Hector on drums, who has toured with me before, but since then has been playing with Iggy Pop and Tom York and Katie Tunstall and others, Soft Cell. And this tour is kind of a preview of a large show that I'm putting together for the end of this year, beginning of next year, which is a symphonic performance. I'm basically writing a symphony about the 80s, which combines my own music with quotes from music that influenced me or music that I thought was culturally important. Quotes from people like The Cure, The Smiths, Depeche Mode, Joy Division, Peter Gabriel, Echo and the Bunnymen, all sorts of different people are sort of quoted in this symphony using their melodies or chords as sort of symphonic motifs that I develop. Since working at the Peabody Conservatory, I've become sort of fascinated with the symphony orchestra. I sort of think it's the last frontier for me, really. And when we talk about AI, I was talking about the resonance. You see in a great orchestra that are really on it. And their fingertips are responding in real time to, their open strings, their neighbors in their section, the sound from under the stage or the back of the hall, the open piano lid, the timpani that is ringing, and all interpreted by the conductor. And when it's working, it's like watching a school of fish or a flock of birds. You don't notice the individual decisions, you just see the overall movement of the group. And I find that absolutely mesmerizing. And so the last couple of years, I've been sort of trying to get myself up to speed with orchestration and instrumentation. And my hope is that this show will go out around symphony orchestras in the USA in their POPs program. A lot of them do these kinds of things, but often they're tributes. Often they're absent the original artist. It would be like Beethoven x Beyonce or something like that.
Yeah.
But she ain't going to be there,
Right.
In my case, it's very much a first-hand account. It's like a sort of a journal of my adventures in the 80s. And multiple vocalists, so, in my band, so both Gail and Andrew share lead vocals with me. But before I get it anywhere near an expensive symphony orchestra, I need to routine the materials. So I'm sort of workshopping, my shtick and the flow of the show. And if you come and see it, you will get a sneak preview of this symphony with a virtual orchestra projected behind me on a screen.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, I saw you on the Totally Tubular Festival, and you did something like, I think it was like a tribute to Bowie. Is it going to be similar to that format, but only obviously with the symphony and much, much larger?
Yeah, I mean, it's about sort of unpacking and reimagining those songs in a different style. So, if you take away the beat, you sort of reduce it to melody and harmony and, add some different colors, you can sort of throw a different lens on our built-in memory of those moments. And a lot of younger fans are fascinated by it as well, because there is this sort of obsession with the 80s, not only among people that were there, like you and me, but I mean, with people that were yet to be born. Right. There's a certain sort of rarefied air around what was going on in the 80s and the whole melting pot of music that was taking place that I think is made additionally fascinating by the sort of proclivity these days for sort of mass market pop stuff that is virtually free on streaming services.
Yeah, you're right about that. My son is 23, and probably half of his playlist is music from the 80s. It's my fault, of course. He's influenced by me. But and then, of course, in May, you're going to head over to Europe to perform 2 weeks of shows throughout the UK, and I'm sure those shows will probably be similar to the ones here in the States, correct?
Yeah, it's actually with the same format, different band. When I eventually tour with this, I'm going to need to have more than one person in each role, because I won't be touring per se. It'll be the odd weekend here and there, flying into a different city. And so I can't depend on having musicians available all the time. So I need to have, more than one person ready to go at the drop of a hat. So I'll be touring the UK and Ireland with different musicians over there.
Yeah, and then you're also gearing up for another summer tour, the Totally Tubular Festival, which features several bands. So far, I think I've seen an announcement for one show in Louisville, and I guess more cities will follow. Can you give us a little more details about the lineup for this festival?
Yeah, I mean, so the Totally Tubular Festival is a piece of fun. People go there to see a rapid fire of 80s acts they know and hear a lot of hits. It's not really Dolby fans per se, it's sort of 80s music fans, and so they know maybe half a dozen of my songs, but not the deep cuts. And we don't have, they're short sets, very rapid changeovers, and, a lot of fun. So I'm actually... I'm reforming Lost Toy People, which was my LA band when I did Aliens Ate My Buick, and we'll be performing most of that album.
That's awesome.
And a few other hits. So mostly, no click, no stems or anything, just live, possibly a horn section. Haven't really decided that yet. And and actually, I mean, as always, you have to balance art and commerce. I mean, it's, the Totally Tubular shows will pay for my symphonic experiments, and hopefully the books will be balanced by the end of the summer.
Oh, that's awesome. It sounds like you're still incredibly busy. And that I have to say I'm personally excited about your being back with the Lost Toy People on this tour. I'm going to try to come and find one of those shows this summer because I'd like to see that. Of course, and I'll be at the show April 19th in Indianapolis as well, so hope to see you there.
Great.
Well, Thomas, thanks for your time. I hope you enjoyed this. I certainly did. It's been a long time coming that I've wanted to get you on the show, and I appreciate everything you've done for us here today.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
All right, take care. Special thanks to Thomas Dolby for joining us on this episode of Inside MusiCast. We also want to thank our Inside MusiCast correspondents for their support and dedication, including Brian Pearson in Chicago, Kim Riley in South Florida, Scott Gross in Tampa, Mikhail Engstrom in Stockholm, Scott Sheriff in Nashville, Don Breidup in Toronto, Loretta Sassaman in Seattle, Yinka Oyalese in Boston, and Arnaud Leger in Paris. You can show your support for Inside MusiCast by making a donation at InsideMusicCast.com. Your donation will help us continue to make future episodes of Inside MusiCast, and you can also receive special Inside MusiCast merch for your support at various levels. For Eddie Cabello, I'm Rick Such. Thanks for your support of Inside MusiCast.